They did not reject humanity's petition because they thought we were dangerous. They rejected it because they thought we were boring. And when the Galaxy Council wanted to close the matter permanently, without cruelty, without a formal declaration of anything, they did what every polite civilization does when it wants a problem to go away without admitting it was ever a problem. They gave us a gift. The gift was a decommissioned arbitration intelligence, model designation Meridian class, serial number worn down to 3 legible digits. 300 years old by council reckoning, which made it roughly the age of the United States by ours. It had mediated 412 interspecies disputes before its final assignment. A border dispute between 2 methane-breathing polities that had ended, according to the transfer documentation, within acceptable parameters. After that, it sat in a storage bay for 6 decades collecting dust that wasn't dust, because dust requires atmosphere and the bay had none. The transfer document was 11 pages long. It used the word commemorative 4 times. It used the word obsolete once, buried in a subclause about liability, which Dr. Priya Nair would later point out was the only honest sentence in the entire packet. The council's stated reasoning, delivered by Councillor Vethik Suranya with a smile that had been calibrated over 4 centuries of diplomatic practice, was this: humanity's petition for provisional membership demonstrated considerable enthusiasm, but insufficient formal rigor in its reasoning structures. The Meridian Core, he explained, represented the pinnacle of council logical architecture. A system so far beyond human cognitive frameworks that it would serve, in his words, an educational function. He did not say the word toy. He did not have to, the smile said it for him. Vethik Suranya was Corvine, a species with skin the color of wet slate and eyes set slightly too far apart, which gave every one of his expressions a faint air of appraisal, as though he were perpetually deciding whether you were worth the oxygen. He spoke English without an accent, without hesitation, without a single grammatical error in 11 months of negotiations. Because the Council had been listening to Earth's broadcasts for 200 years, and had concluded correctly that fluency was the cheapest form of condescension available. We had to learn nothing. They had already learned everything about us and found most of it unremarkable. The transfer documentation specified that the Corps carried no treaty obligations, no protection guarantees, no continuing technical support, and no expectation of operational success. It arrived orbital tow, wrapped in insulation foam that had degraded to something like ash, painted along one flank with the disposal category stripe every council surplus asset wore before final decommission. Orange, non-functional. For educational retention only. The room went quiet when the translation finished, not the specific quiet of anger which has a texture, a held breath. This was the flatter quiet of people recalculating what they had just been told they were worth. Dr. Amara Osai broke it. She had been sitting at the back of the delegation not because her rank was low, but because her rank did not exist in any category the council recognized. Cognitive scientist, decision theorist. A woman who had spent 11 years being told, gently and then not gently, that her research program was a dead end. "I want to run it," she said. Nobody answered her immediately because nobody had asked her a question. "I want to run the Corps," she said again, "not study it, run it." Amara Osai's doctoral thesis, submitted 14 years earlier to a committee that approved it with visible reluctance, argued that bounded, intuitive, heuristic-driven cognition would systematically outperform formal deductive logic in any negotiation involving incomplete information about the other party's values. The paper was cited 9 times in its first decade, 6 of those citations critical. Her tenure committee had called the work an interesting failure of ambition. She had kept the letter. She kept most letters like that. It was, she had told a colleague once, cheaper than therapy and more motivating. She had not expected to be right about an alien arbitration computer 3 centuries her senior. She had expected, if anything, to spend the rest of her career arguing with people who had never run a single experiment in a room with actual stakes in it. They stripped what they thought was sensitive, she told the assembled engineers 2 days later, standing in front of the Corps' housing while a technician ran a surface scan that was returning almost nothing. The drive schematics gone, the weapons interface gone, even the propulsion logs gone, but look at what they left. She tapped the housing once over a section still humming faintly with residual charge. They left the reasoning engine. All 412 case files. Every negotiation this thing ever mediated still sitting in memory because to them that's the part with no strategic value. That's the part they consider furniture. Dr. Marcus Binaire, who had spent 19 years writing formal verification software for systems that were never allowed to make a mistake, looked at the scan output for a long moment before he spoke. "I'm interested in everything else," Osai said, and it was the quietest sentence in the room, and it landed like a held breath finally released. The discovery loop began in the weapons bay, which was empty. Benaire went in first, because he had been the one to argue 3 years earlier in a paper nobody read, that any formal logic system complex enough to negotiate 412 interspecies disputes would necessarily contain generalizable architecture that its designers had never intended to be generalizable. He had been laughed out of 2 conferences for that claim. He walked into the stripped bay with the specific stillness of a man who has been waiting a long time to be allowed to be right. He did not speak for 11 minutes. He knelt beside an access panel that had been left, apparently by oversight, unstripped, tracing a lattice of conduit with 2 fingers, because his hands needed something to do while his mind caught up with what his eyes were reporting. "This isn't a weapons bay anymore," he said finally. "It's a substrate. The logic core doesn't just live in its housing. It's distributed through the entire hull, load-bearing and computational at once. They didn't strip the sensitive systems, they stripped the systems they thought were separate from the reasoning engine." He sat back on his heels. "There is no separation, the whole ship thinks." He went quiet again, and the quiet this time had a different shape because he had just understood something and had not yet decided how to say it. "If the whole ship thinks," he said, "then the whole ship remembers." Dr. Yusuf Idris owned the simulation core, and he had been mocked for 8 years for a working paper arguing that any sufficiently advanced negotiation intelligence would necessarily contain, buried in its case resolution logs, complete adversarial models of every species it had ever mediated between. Not summaries, full behavioral simulations built and refined across 4 centuries of disputes, because you cannot mediate a conflict you cannot predict. He found the first simulation 11 days into the project, in a subroutine so deeply nested that the extraction software crashed twice before Benaire rewrote it from scratch. It was a full tactical model of a Corvine border fleet, weapons loadouts included, drawn from a dispute the Meridian Corps had mediated 140 years earlier. Idris did not sit down on the floor. He stood very still, one hand flat against the console, and said nothing for almost a minute, because his legs had not stopped working exactly, but something in his chest had. "They gave us a complete model of their own military doctrine," he said eventually, "because they filed it under diplomatic archive instead of strategic asset." He looked at Osai. "They think in categories. We're not in their category for danger. We're in their category for pity, so they didn't check what was sitting inside the pity." Dr. Priya Nair owned the translation matrix, and her discovery took the longest, because it required something the others' discoveries had not. She had to prove a negative. She had to prove that the core's negotiation logic contained no formal representation for the specific kind of reasoning humans used constantly, and council species apparently did not. She had spent 6 years being told by 2 separate departments that her work on the semiotics of diplomatic ambiguity was linguistics, not science. She had kept those emails too. On day 19, running 412 historical case files through a comparative model, she found what she had been looking for, not an error but an absence. Every council negotiation in the archive resolved through exhaustive multivariable optimization, weighing declared values against declared constraints until a formally provable equilibrium emerged. Every single one. In 4 centuries and 412 disputes, the Meridian Corps had never once encountered a negotiating party that simply changed the rules of the game mid-negotiation, because no council species had ever tried. She went quiet for a long moment, because she had spent 6 years defending a discipline nobody respected. And the confirmation, when it finally arrived too large to speak immediately. "It has no model for bluffing," she said. "Not a bad model, no model, because none of them do it to each other. They think in stable categories and they never leave the category once they've assigned it." She looked at the transfer documentation still open on a side screen, at the word educational, at the disposal stripe on the hull scan behind it. "They assigned us a category 3 centuries before we existed," she said, "and they've never once checked whether we're still in it." The council found out on the 31st day, not because of a leak, but because the Meridian Corps' dormant transponder had spent 3 decades broadcasting a maintenance ping every 6 hours, a habit nobody had bothered to disable because a decommissioned educational artifact was not expected to need one. And somebody in a council archive office finally noticed the ping's power signature had changed. The communication arrived formatted exactly like every other council document humanity had received, numbered, subclaused, and devastating in its politeness. This office has become aware of unauthorized reactivation and querying of restricted arbitration architecture transferred under Commemorative Provision 7. The transferring party notes that while the physical asset was conveyed without restriction, the embedded case archive remains classified council property under continuing intellectual protections not disclosed in the original transfer documentation. An omission this office regrets. You are directed to cease all extraction activity and permit remote decommission of the reasoning core within 48 standard hours. Failure to comply will be treated, regrettably, as a material escalation. There was no threat in it that a human diplomat would have recognized as a threat. There did not need to be. Everyone in the room understood that material escalation, in 4 centuries of council correspondence, had never once been followed by a conversation. Osai read it twice. She did not look afraid. She looked, if anything, like someone recalculating a schedule. 48 hours, she said. Idris was already pulling up the Corvine tactical model on the main screen. Then we stop being careful, he said, and start being fast. The 48 hours ended at 600. And at 6033, Corvine reclamation vessels dropped out of transit 14,000 kilometers from the Meridian Core's orbital dock, weapons hot. Running the exact formation the Meridian Core's own case archive had recorded 140 years earlier. Because the Council had not changed a doctrine that had never needed changing. Because nobody had ever made them change it. 32 rail guns, 3 ships. A doctrine built around synchronized gravitational compensation, each vessel timing its return fire to a shared compensator cycle so that no single ship was ever caught mid-recoil. Idris had built the counter in 6 days from the archive simulation. It was not clever, it was arithmetic. The Meridian Core's own logs contained the exact timing of that compensator cycle, because 140 years earlier, during a border dispute the Core had mediated, this same fleet doctrine had been fully modeled down to the millisecond as evidence for a settlement. Nobody on the Council side had ever imagined that record would end up in enemy hands, because nobody on the Council side had ever imagined an enemy capable of holding it. Humanity's ships fired 11 seconds before the compensator window opened. The lead Corvine vessel took the first hit across its forward gravitational array and lost formation lock. It did not explode. It tumbled, engines flaring erratically, weapons silent, and for 4 seconds it looked almost graceful, a machine that had simply forgotten how to hold itself together. The second vessel adjusted. It shifted its firing pattern off the compensator cycle entirely, a maneuver the archive had no record of, because no Council fleet had needed it in 140 years. For 6 seconds it landed clean fire, and one human corvette lost half its hull plating and vented atmosphere in a bright, uneven spiral. Humanity adapted in the 7th second. Bonair's substrate model, run-live off the Meridian Core's own distributed processing, rerouted targeting solutions faster than any human gunnery officer could have manually. Because the ship doing the calculating had spent 300 years learning to calculate faster than the species that built it. The third vessel broke off entirely at the 90-second mark, accelerating away from the engagement with its weapons cold. Nobody pursued it. Osai gave the order herself over comms in 4 words. Let it report back. The battle lasted 3 minutes and 41 seconds. The official Council transmission arrived 9 hours later, formal, subclaused, unchanged in tone from every communication before it, closing the matter with the phrase regrettable operational outcome and no acknowledgement beyond that. The personal transmission arrived 4 hours after the official one. Unscheduled, unlisted, routed through a private channel that should not have existed in any diplomatic protocol Osai's team had catalogued. Vethik Surandya did not smile in this one. There was a silence at the start of it, 3 full seconds, long enough that Osai almost thought the connection had failed before his voice finally came through, quieter than she had ever heard it. I assumed, he said, that a reasoning engine without formal proof structures would produce reasoning without formal value. That was audacious of me, not of you, of me. Another pause. We have spent 4 centuries categorizing species by the shape of their logic. We never accounted for a species that treats the shape of the logic as something to be discarded the moment it stops being useful. I do not know what to file you under. I am no longer certain the filing system was ever complete. The transmission ended there. No formal closing, no diplomatic seal. Osai was already back at her console before the room had finished processing what they had just heard. Pulling up the case archives index, 412 files. 300 years of Council reasoning laid bare because nobody had thought the furniture was worth locking. We cracked 40% of the propulsion architecture ourselves in 18 months before any of this, she said, mostly to Bonair, mostly thinking out loud. With the full case archive indexed properly, cross-referenced against every dispute this thing has ever mediated, we're not looking at 18 months anymore. How long? Idris asked. 6, she said, maybe less. She was already scrolling, already flagging files, already 3 moves ahead of the conversation she was having, and it's not just propulsion. It's everything they ever decided was safe to let us see, because they never once checked what safe meant to us. She did not look up from the screen. She had already stopped thinking about the battle. She had been thinking about the next 18 months since roughly month 2. 18 months since roughly month 2.